scare you with the fact that you could piss off the right people. And it's obviously not the first time that people in the media have been, I guess, shut up. They try to shut him down or shut him up, like the Gary Webb story and many others.
I suppose your listeners may already know who Michael Hastings is, but it's always my tendency to provide some background because I don't know that they do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Michael Hastings was a journalist, a reasonably young journalist who had scored a bunch of significant coups and in the process angered some very powerful people in the Pentagon and the CIA and so forth. And what happened was that a couple of years ago, he was working on a story that he said was very, very sensitive. He told friends that he thought that the FBI was investigating him. He indicated that he was doing a story about the head of the CIA. He said he had some amazing stuff, and he was going to have to maybe even go, shall we say, underground for a bit. He also told his neighbor that he feared that somebody had been tampering with his car, and he begged her to let him use her car. Now, the next day, while driving along an empty Los Angeles street, his car suddenly went out of control, jumped the median and plunged into a tree, and then it exploded, and the engine flew out, depending on what account you read, somewhere between 50 and 150 feet. On WhoWhatWhy.org, we were the first, I believe, news organization to really ask any questions. We obtained footage from the pizza parlor across the way. We talked to experts about car crashes and car design and so on. And there were some very serious questions as to whether this could have been something other than an accident, given all the other things I just described to you. And yet the media, the police, and the FBI and everybody rushed to say it was definitely an accident. Case was closed. Let me tell you something. When you close a case, whether it's that or the Boston bombing, without a investigation going on for weeks or months, you're not investigating.
Oh, absolutely. You're right. I think the Michael Hastings thing's really interesting because I think Mercedes wouldn't comment on how the motor ended up being, I forget how many feet away from the vehicle, and I don't know if anybody ever looked in, or if you looked into the cremation of his body. I know some people reported that they cremated his body before anybody gave it.
Yeah, that was a false story.
That was.
We debunked it. There was a person describing herself as a journalist who had briefly got a flurry of attention on the internet, and she said some things that were not correct. Look, this stuff has to be handled by serious journalists who are professional and are not trying to whip up hysteria, but are trying to do a serious, open-minded job of investigating.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That's why I love your work, and I love when you do these interviews, because you're not afraid to get into these stories that might be, what mainstream media might call fringe stories or whatnot. And you obviously are very credible. You've written for Vanity Fair. You've written for tons of different publications, and you're not one of those people that are conspiracy theorists. You're not an Alex Jones who's just connecting dots that aren't there and scaring the shit out of everybody. But I've always loved your work and Jesse Ventura's work because you're people that just look at the facts and then just state them. And even if some people might call you conspiracy theorists or whatnot, you don't stray away from certain stories, because if something makes sense to you, you'll still go there.
Well, let me say something. Number one, nobody can call me a conspiracy theorist, and I don't allow that, and I reject that because it's just bullshit.
Yeah.
Because they're using that term as a pejorative to suggest that somebody is whacked out. There is nobody who read my book or has followed my work for 25 years who doesn't find my work to be serious, careful, and fully documented. So that's just bull. Number two, the term conspiracy theorist, anybody who deploys that should be looked into themselves, and I'll tell you why. If you go online and you Google conspiracy theorist, put it in quotes, and CIA memo, and I want to say 1967, there was a CIA memo talking about the importance of discouraging people from looking into the Kennedy assassination, asking questions, questioning whether the CIA may have known anything about it. And this memo was calling for pushing out to the CIA's, quote, media assets, this term conspiracy theorist or conspiracy theory as a way of demonizing those who asked questions. And so we have to fight back. We have been kind of unwittingly, of course, brainwashed to these terms fill our heads. The intelligent discussion of real facts is shut down by this, kind of programming, essentially. I mean, I wasn't going after you, but because you get this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the CIA purposely, like you said, they purposely attempted to use that term to discredit people. And I think, after JFK assassination and so I mean, and unfortunately, I think a lot of times when people use that term, it like you said, it is to discredit people. But there's plenty of, even if you do, and that's the thing, like they don't really criticize the information you're giving. It's certain taboo stories. So it's like, even if I'm talking about the Boston bombing or Adam Lanza or James Holmes or any of those things, if I'm just questioning it, it has nothing to do with the actual conversation we're having and the facts or questions I might have. But it's just the fact that I'm even touching or questioning those stories. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, you must be a conspiracy theorist. And I do think that there is an issue with, after every single event, there's people who just jump to the opportunity to call it a false flag and do all these things. So, and then you get lumped into those people, and you're just like, oh, you're just one of those people who question absolutely everything. But, a lot of times, what will happen is that you pick one side or the other. Either a lot of people end up jumping to the conclusion that it's a false flag, or jumping to the conclusion that it wasn't, and anybody who thinks otherwise is just a conspiracy theorist. So,
well, let me say that the people who jump to conclusions that it is a plot and those who jump to conclusions that it isn't, they all deserve each other. They're all the same thing. Okay. And I would say that those radio shows and those things that whip people up into hysteria, often over false things, are either themselves disinformation agents, or they're as bad, they're just reckless people. And it really is a kind of a crime against the public interest to do that. So I would dismiss them, and I would dismiss the people who call other people conspiracy theorists. I dismiss all of them, because the only legitimate position to take and the only honorable position to take is to be agnostic, to be open-minded, and to be willing to look at facts.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think you're right. They're doing a disservice by jumping to those conclusions, because when you start connecting dots that aren't there, and you consistently start calling everything a conspiracy theory or a false flag event, then people are going to stop listening. And I think that's what ends up happening. There's so much of that just nonsense that people have to filter out, and people are just, I think it gets to a point where, like I said, it ends up making it harder for people who actually want to have honest conversations about these type of things, because you do end up bringing up these certain issues or these certain events, and people automatically will just categorize you that you're conspiracy theorists. And I mean, unfortunately, that sometimes is the case. But I know just recently on your WhoWhatWhy website, you guys talked about Hiroshima, and one thing that I think is really interesting about history in general is that how, that old quote that history is written by the winners, and it certainly is true, because I remember watching the Untold History of the United States by Oliver Stone, and his just telling the story of Hiroshima, and then reading up on the fact that they didn't have to drop the bomb, and it was, I guess, officially they did it to win the war, but unofficially they did it as an experiment, and probably to send a message to the Russians. So is that do you think that that's what happened? And in your investigation into it, is that what you learned?
Well, I didn't investigate it. It's a website that I'm the editor-in-chief of, and I'm going to leave that to those who wrote the articles or did the podcasts for us, because they're the ones who looked into that.
What's your opinion on it?
Well, I mean, people always ask me, who's going to win the election, with this and that. I always give the same answer, is that unless I personally looked into something, I don't really know any more about it than you do. You read those articles. The people who wrote them are respected, thoughtful people. Are they right? I don't know. I mean, honestly, I think if you talk to the editor of the New York Times or the Atlantic Monthly, I think they would tell you the same thing, is that they try to make choices of writers and reporters and researchers who seem to do good work, and they let their work stand on its own.
But I think it goes to a bigger point that one thing that's always been really interesting to me when I started this podcast and really started diving into historical events and stories more and more, is that how much influence people who write these stories and teach these stories how much influence they have on the public's perception of past events and then current events and future events. Because like the Hiroshima thing, a lot of people do believe that they didn't have to drop the bomb, that they, it was because of Project Manhattan, they spent all this money on development, and it was really to send a message to the Russians afterwards, and Truman, no matter what, was going to drop the bomb. It's just one of those things where these other sides of these stories, these other perspectives of people just questioning it, a lot of times you don't run into this stuff unless you find work, your work like you did on the Bushes and Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States, and so many other people who question our perspective, or Howard Zinn or whoever that questions one perspective of history. And I think it's kind of dangerous, the fact that you look back and it's like, if you don't accidentally run into some of these things like Who, What, Why or Family of Secrets, sometimes your ignorance might come, it might not be your own fault. It might just be of lack of being exposed to the right information, or at least information to question what you think you know. And
I mean, one of the great dangers is how, and I think this is what you're talking about, how we get our information and where it comes from. Because in our society, we have sort of intellectual elites, if you want to call it that, or certainly economic elites and so on. And those economic elites are very much targeted in order to shape their perceptions, because they're influential. They have an impact on other people. So it's important, let's say, to get the talking heads who are on CNN all on the same page. Now, how do you do that? Well, where do they get their information? They read the New York Times. They read the Atlantic Monthly. They read a certain number of things. They watch Charlie Rose or whatever. So if Charlie Rose, where does he get his choice about his guests? Maybe he reads the Atlantic Monthly, And so this is how the process works. And paradoxically, I have found that some of the best educated, most successful people know the least about how things actually work. And it seems impossible that people in high-powered corporate law firms, people working at, who went to Harvard and work in the State Department and stuff, could know less than the rest of us. But my work, I've discovered that that's true, because the things you're talking about, Oliver Stone's history, they didn't read it. Okay. Howard Zinn, maybe they read him, maybe not. Did they take it seriously? I'm not sure. The stuff we're talking about, Boston Marathon bombing, they don't know anything about that, because they're all reading controlled media, essentially. And so it's this kind of a vicious loop, and it's garbage in, garbage out, and they do dominate our culture.
Yeah, they're all reading Atlas Shrugged and and not realizing that the Christians that are reading it about talking about capitalism and all this stuff are the same people who don't realize that Ayn Rand wasn't religious. But it's funny, because you do see conversations with people that are in high ranked positions, and I'm just amazed sometimes by just the lack of knowledge of history, or the lack of I don't know if it's on purpose or whatnot, but there's a podcast I listen to where they have some intellectuals on, and everyone, some of these people have huge influence on foreign policy and stuff like that. And it's amazing how they talk about how, we thought the Iraq war was a good idea and this, and I'm like, these are the people who are influencing our decisions. I mean, these are the people who are making these decisions. I mean, I understand the average person who goes to a full-time job and doesn't have time to research or read, and then basically their information that they consume daily is watching whatever the nightly news is right before they go to bed and pass out, and then do the whole routine again. But they have kids, they have priorities, all this stuff. So it's amazing the people who actually spend their time researching this stuff, how little they know sometimes, or at least how little they pretend they know, or how they. I mean, it's just amazing to me, because like you said, it is. To me, this alternative media sometimes has better information, better researched information than the mainstream media, and these, like you said, intellectuals, or people who are supposed to have well thought out ideas and opinions.
Well, if you think about it, there's a pattern here, which is that almost everything seems to be backwards.
Yeah, that's true. So somebody who's researched the Bush family, and also quite a bit about the history of the Bushes and